Hello, class. Today we're going to talk about the digestive system. So, why do we need the digestive system? Well, at the cellular level, organisms need a couple of major building blocks in order to survive. They need nucleotides, lipids, simple sugars, and amino acids. And when we eat food, the food we eat consists of macromolecules protein, multiple amino acids, fat, complex lipids, and complex carbs, which are simple sugars put together. So, in order to get the energy out of the food that we eat, we have to break down these substances in order to get nucleotides, lipids, sugars, and amino acids. The conversion process from food to nutrients involves two major steps: digestion and absorption. Now, the different types of digestive systems, to understand them better, we can look at the types of foods that these organisms eat. So, broadly speaking, we have three classifications: herbivores, which are animals that eat plants exclusively, think like cows or sheep, anything that grazes. We have carnivores, which are animals that eat other animals. Ecologically, we call these predators. And then omnivores, which are animals that eat both plants and other animals. And of course, humans are omnivores, usually. So, where does the digestion actually happen? Well, it depends on how big the organism is. If you're a single celled organism, and some types of sponges, which are bigger than single celled, we're going to see intracellular digestion, meaning all of the digestive processes start by the food crossing the cell membrane, entering the cell, and then being digested. That's not what happens with multicellular animals like humans. We first digest our food extracellularly, then we absorb it and do it intracellularly. So, extracellularly, we're thinking within a digestive cavity. So, you eat the food, it goes into your mouth, and inside your mouth, digestion is happening before the food crosses a cell membrane and actually enters your cells. And it happens all throughout the alimentary canal. Certain types of cnidarians and flatworms have a similar cavity to us. They have a gastrovascular cavity, which only has one opening and no specialized regions. And here's a picture of a cnidarian. You can see its stinging tentacles that makes it a cnidarian. So, when it comes to the types of digestive systems, we like to focus on this concept of specialization, which, going back to the lectures on the development of the blastopore, this is where the digestive tract has a separate mouth and anus. In other words, food comes into one end of the tube and goes out the other end of the tube. Complex animals have more complex digestive tracts that are specialized in different regions. We call ours the alimentary canal because there's a single canal where the food goes through from top to bottom, mouth to anus, and then there are multiple accessory organs involved along the way. And here are just some pictures of simple and complex digestive systems in different types of organisms. You can see the nematode as one of the more simple ones. Its intestine is just a straight tube. An earthworm has a crop and a gizzard, special types of stomachs that allow it to digest food mechanically. And then we have a salamander, which has even more specialized organs, including a little liver and a pancreas. And we'll talk a little bit about the functions of these accessory organs. Whoops. So, ingested food can be stored immediately, or it can be subjected to physical fragmentation. Physical fragmentation means we're physically breaking down the food. So, we don't swallow our food whole, we're not like snakes. Humans use their teeth as the first step to physically break down food. After physical fragmentation, the next step is chemical digestion, and this usually happens through a series of hydrolysis reactions that are catalyzed in the stomach and small intestine of organisms. And during these chemical digestive steps, we see products passing through the gut's epithelial lining and into the blood. This is the process known as absorption. When something passes through an epithelial lining, meaning the cell membranes of the cells that line the digestive tract, and enter into the blood, that is absorption. And whatever is left behind is waste, and those are excreted from the anus. So when we talk about the layout of the digestive system in vertebrates, generally speaking, we're going to see a pathway that's really similar to this one. We start with our mouth and pharynx. This is the entry where food comes in, where you put food into your pie hole. Then you have the esophagus, which is a tube that delivers food from your mouth or your oral cavity to the stomach. The stomach is the preliminary stage of digestion. This is where the first major chemical digestive steps happen. Then we have our small intestine. This is the first absorption organ. This is important. This is where absorption or food nutrients crossing the cell membrane begins to happen. Then we have our large intestine, which is the rear end of our digestive system. This is where we just absorb what water and minerals are left behind. And then finally, we reach the end stage of our digestive tube, which is either the cloaca in certain organisms like reptiles or birds, or the rectum in, say, mammals. And this is where waste is gathered and then expelled. And here's a nice picture laying out those steps. We start in the mouth. The oral cavity is actually what's in the mouth. The space inside of the mouth leading down to the pharynx. The pharynx is a broad word referring to the throat space, so it could be the oropharynx, the part of the throat that's closest to the mouth, the nasopharynx closer to the nose. The tube connecting the pharynx to the stomach down here is the esophagus. It's a muscular tube that actually squeezes food down the path, and we'll look at a little diagram in a second. And after the stomach, we reach the first portion of the small intestine, the duodenum over here. This is where a lot of the accessory organs, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, actually do their work. Then we have the small intestine, this convoluted, wrapped up tube down here. Food passes from the small intestine into the cecum, which is the first part of the large intestine, this larger brown tube, which wraps around, up, around, and down to the end where we reach the rectum and then eventually the anus where food comes out. That's the general pathway that food follows throughout the alimentary canal, and you'll notice that the liver, so if I'm a highlighter, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas are all major organs along the way that food does not actually enter. Food does not go into your liver or into the gallbladder or into the pancreas. These are three of the major accessory organs that we have. And here's a nice little video, though, that you can watch on your own to see the pathway of food from top to bottom. So those three major accessory organs are liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. These are the three main ones that I care about. The function of the liver in the digestive system is to produce bile. It does a number of other things that I don't care about. The liver produces bile, or bile salts. The function of the gallbladder is to store the bile. It concentrates the bile and helps release it. But the gallbladder is where bile is stored. The liver is where bile is made. Then we have our pancreas, which serves a number of functions, both endocrine and digestive. In the digestive system, the pancreas produces juice. It produces pancreatic juice. And inside of this juice are digestive enzymes and bicarbonate buffer, which help deal with the pH of the stomach. So here is a cross-section of a region of the small intestine, and you can see a number of important structures. So outside of the gastrointestinal tract, or this big cylinder here, the circular tube, is the actual tract that food is traveling through. Outside of the tract, over here in yellow, you see glands. The tract is completely lined with glands just right outside of the tube, and these glands produce secretions that help us digest food and move the food down the path. So the lumen You're going to see this word a lot. Lumen just refers to space. A lumen is an open space or an open cavity inside of the body. So the hole, the actual space that the food travels through, is the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract. The mucosa consists of one of the major layers that line the digestive tract. The actual layers are from the lumen, the center of the tube outwards. You have the lumen, the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis layer, which includes the circular and longitudinal layer, and then the serosa, which is the outermost layer. What I want you guys to take away from this is that the major layers are the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis the muscularis externa, and then the serosa. Almost every part of our digestive tract, with a few exceptions, has these layers. And the lumen isn't really a layer, it's the whole inside. These plexuses, the submucosal plexus and the myenteric plexus, are nerves. They are nerves that control the contraction and relaxation of the entire gastrointestinal tract. Keep in mind that the muscularis, like the name implies, is muscle. So muscles can contract and relax, and as they contract and relax, they help food move throughout the gastrointestinal tract. And their contractions are completely involuntary. We don't control how food moves down our stomach or through our small intestine. All of that happens because of these plexuses. The submucosal plexus controlling the submucosal layer, and then the myenteric plexus, which is controlling the contraction of the circular and longitudinal layer of muscle. Now, we talked a little bit about physical fragmentation, and that happens in the mouth because of our dentition, because of our teeth. And one thing to keep in mind is that most vertebrate have teeth that allow us to do this process known as mastication. That refers to the physical process of chewing. Chewing means mastication. Some organisms don't have that. For example, birds. Here's a bird. Birds don't have teeth, in case you haven't noticed. And because they don't have teeth, they can't physically break down their food the same way we do. So the way that they handle it is, let me see if I can blow up this image. Oh god. Inside of this bird here, you'll notice that they have multiple chambers that make up their stomach. They have a crop over here. They have their actual stomach. And then they have their gizzard. You might have heard of birds having a gizzard, or organisms having a gizzard. A gizzard, let me make this bird small again. A gizzard is a muscular chamber that the bird uses to pulverize food. And the way they do it is they actually eat rocks. They eat pebbles. And the pebbles settle into their gizzard. They're not able to continue on through the digestive tract. And because the pebbles are there, when they eat food, their gizzard contracts and relaxes and mixes the food inside with the pebbles, and that physically breaks down what they eat. Very interesting process for them to get around not having teeth. Now, with other organisms that do have dentition, that do have teeth, we can see different types of teeth. The 4 major types of teeth, and I can't highlight it in this little box here, but make sure you know these 4 right here. The incisors, which make up sort of the front teeth. When you think of somebody having buck teeth or like a beaver's front 2 teeth, those are the incisors, the frontmost teeth. Then you have the canines. Those are the pointy teeth. You can see them really easily, really prominent on this skull of a lion. Then you have the premolars, which are the flat teeth on the side of your mouth just before you reach your molars, which are your true flat teeth at the very back of your mouth. Those are the teeth that are used for grinding and chewing on plant-like material. You'll notice that organisms have different numbers of teeth and different shapes of the different types of teeth depending on what they eat. So carnivores, we talked about, are organisms that eat other organisms. So you're going to be eating a lot of meat. You're going to want canines. Those are the pointed teeth. Canines. And because they have these big pointed canines, they are able to rip and chew through meat, but they don't necessarily have or need to have the big flat molars that allow them to grind plant material because they don't eat plants. So generally speaking, carnivores are going to see pointed teeth. Even their molars here are pointed. Then you have herbivores. They have huge, large, flat teeth, which are useful for grinding the cell walls of plant tissues, the cellulose in plant wall tissues. As we'll talk about, cellulose is really hard for some organisms to digest, so having big, flat teeth helps with that. And then humans and other omnivores have a mix. We've got the sharp carnivore-like teeth out in the front, and then we have the big, flat herbivore-like teeth in the back. And one other thing that I want you guys to know with regards to humans is the number of teeth that an adult human has. An adult human has 32 teeth. And the breakdown of that is 8, 4, 8, 12. Meaning we have 8 incisors, 4 canines. It's a little smaller. We have 8 incisors, so 4 or 2 like flat front teeth in every quadrant of our mouth. We have 4 canines, 4 pointy teeth, or 1 in each quadrant of our mouth. We generally have 8 premolars and 12 molars. And a lot of times the last molar, the furthest backmost molar in your mouth, in each quadrant of your mouth, is referred to as your wisdom teeth because they are hidden beneath your gums and they don't always come out. Or if they come out later with age. Keep in mind that children have a different number of teeth. I don't care about how many teeth they actually have. There's a reason they fall out. It's so that the adult teeth can come in. So what's going on physically inside of the mouth? Well, inside of the mouth, the tongue also serves a function in digestion. While the teeth are chewing up the food, the tongue is rounding the blob of food that you have into your mouth into a shape that you can swallow. And it's also mixing your food with your saliva. Now, saliva is important biologically. It serves a couple of functions. For one, it moistens and lubricates the food. Keep in mind, I'm going to jump back a few slides here. This tube right here isn't necessarily bigger than the food that we eat. A lot of the times we eat big boluses of food, or we eat large things that kind of distend the walls of this tube, and it would be extremely unpleasant and would rip apart our digestive tract and cause massive internal bleeding if we were to eat something really large and unwieldy that wasn't lubricated. So saliva is the first step in lubricating our food, moistening it and making it easy to pass through our alimentary canal. Also in saliva, we have a very important compound called salivary amylase. This is an enzyme which is located in the saliva, and it's an amylase, which means it breaks down sugars or starches. Salivary amylase starts to begin the process of chemically breaking down starch. Keep in mind, most of the chemical digestion happens in the stomach and in the small intestine later on in the digestive tract. This is one of the first major steps that happens in the mouth. Now, the way we produce saliva is controlled mostly by our nervous system. So, well, you can kind of force yourself to salivate if you tried really hard. Most of it happens involuntarily. Like, we'll taste food, and the food tastes good, and our body will start producing saliva. Sometimes you'll smell something that tastes good, and then your mouth will start watering. It's not like a joke. You'll actually salivate at the smell of good food. And sometimes, for some of us, even thinking or talking about food is enough to stimulate increased salivation. And I feel like I'm salivating a little bit more right now. So, swallowing. Swallowing is the next step after we've chewed our food and mixed it around with our saliva and our tongue has shaped it into a nice little ball. Once we begin swallowing, it's a voluntary action. We think about the process of swallowing food. But that's just the first stage. Getting the food past the oropharynx and to your throat is how we begin swallowing. We kind of lift our tongue upwards and push the food back. But it takes a little bit longer for food to make it down the esophagus. And that's a process that's continued under involuntary control. We don't have to think about moving food from our mouth to our stomach. That all happens courtesy of our nervous system. Now, when the food is ready to be swallowed, our tongue, as I mentioned, moves upwards and back in order to move the food to the back of the mouth. We didn't talk too much about the palate. I'm not too interested in the structures, but this is referring to the top of the mouth. So the soft palate is the soft part of the top of your mouth. The hard part is called the hard palate. The soft palate here serves to prevent food from going up your nose, because your nose, your throat, and your mouth are all kind of connected in the same cavity. And we also have the elevation of our larynx, our vocal folds and vocal cords, our voice box. We elevate our larynx in order to push the glottis against the epiglottis, and I'll show a picture in just a moment. But these are processes that all happen in order to prevent aspiration, in order to prevent food from going out of our digestive tract and into our respiratory tract. We do not want food into our respiratory tract. You don't want to eat food and then have it go into your lungs. Next, as we go down the alimentary canal, is the esophagus. The esophagus, by definition, is a muscular tube connecting the pharynx to the stomach. A muscular tube connecting the pharynx to the stomach, that is the esophagus. The way it does its job is to move the bolus. A bolus is, again, the food that we eat compacted into a ball. The esophagus actively moves the bolus of food from your pharynx to the stomach through a process known as peristalsis. The swallowing center in the brain, we have a region of our brain that controls the voluntary and involuntary processes of swallowing. The swallowing center stimulates a series of contractions, and we'll look at a cool little diagram in a second. It stimulates a series of one-directional waves of contraction, and this is what peristalsis is. All of this is peristalsis. And then finally, we have a special structure at the bottom of our esophagus called a sphincter, and the sphincter opens and closes because it's a muscular ring. It opens when we want to allow food into our stomach, and then it closes so that the things that are in our stomach don't come up. And when you vomit, your sphincter that's closest to your stomach, I'm going to jump to a picture for y'all. The sphincter that I'm referring to would be like right here. This is where the sphincter is that connects the esophagus to the stomach. So when I want food to enter my stomach, the sphincter should be nice and open. There's a big lumen for the food bolus to pass through into your stomach and start getting digested. But once the food's in there, the sphincter contracts and closes so that acid from your stomach doesn't come up through your esophagus, or food doesn't come up through your esophagus back into your mouth and make you vomit. That would be bad. Some people have a dysfunction with the sphincter right here. There's a number of medical concerns associated with your sphincters not being able to open and close properly. But one here is when the lower esophageal sphincter can't close, then acid from your stomach constantly is coming up into your chest and giving you a burning sensation. We call it heartburn, or gastroesophageal reflux disease. So when you say somebody has heartburn, their heart's not actually on fire. It just means that they have acid somewhere in their chest, and it's making you feel like you have a burning sensation somewhere near your heart. Zoom just right. Okay, so let's jump back to the esophagus. We're talking about peristalsis and the sphincter. Here is a picture of peristalsis. So this beige, brown, weird shape of goo is the food bolus. This is what the food looks like. So once you chewed it, covered in saliva, and swallowed it, it's a little unpleasant. So the food starts to move down your esophagus. Remember, up here is where your mouth would be. Down here is where your stomach is eventually going to be. And the way the food moves is through peristalsis. So remember, the esophagus is a muscular tube that allows contraction to happen. Parts of the esophagus will contract at certain times. So the part that's just behind the bolus will contract. This means that the bolus can't go back up, there's no space for it, and it can only go in one direction. Then this part contracts, then this part contracts, and you see a slow downward one-way muscular contraction that slowly pushes the food bolus down. Like if you had like a ball of something that was in a sock and you were just to squeeze the sock around it, you would slowly move the object down the sock until you reach the bottom where everything relaxes because the food moves out of the tube and into the next chamber of the alimentary canal. And that chamber at the end of the esophagus is the stomach. The stomach is shaped like a nice big sack, and it is a really convoluted surface. It's a real rough surface that allows expansion and contraction because of the surface area of the stomach. Now we call the folds that are layered all on the wall, the interior wall of the stomach, rugae. The stomach serves a number of important functions. One function is the partial digestion of proteins. In the mouth, we can break down sugars a little bit with salivary amylase, but we don't really see any protein digestion happen until we reach the stomach. We also see the absorption of some compounds, vitamin B12, alcohol, and aspirin, and a couple of other drugs. This is part of the reason why people who drink tend to see the effects relatively immediately. Like it only takes a few minutes for what you drink to get from your mouth to your stomach. And then the process of absorbing food can take, maybe 12 to 18 hours to get from mouth to anus. But alcohol gets absorbed the moment it reaches your stomach. And so when you drink, it takes very little time for the alcohol to actually have an effect on you. Now, you don't see any significant levels of carb digestion or fat digestion happening in the stomach. This happens later in the tract, in the small intestine. But we do see partial digestion of proteins. So there is no major fat or carb digestion. And you also don't see any major absorption happening. Remember, the two processes are digestion and absorption. Digestion, breaking stuff down, absorbing, sucking it up into the cells. We don't see the sucking up happening in the stomach with the exception of vitamin B12, alcohol, and aspirin. Most of the absorption will happen in our intestines. Now, at this point, we have our, jumping back one slide, we have our food bolus, this beige thing, coming into the stomach. It mixes with the gastric juice. Gastric juice is mostly stomach acid, which I should write as hydrochloric acid because that's the acid it is. When you mix together digestive food and gastric juice, you end up with a nasty mixture, gooey mixture we call chyme. And then just another little medical note. Acid is bad for us in general. Like if I was to drop hydrochloric acid on my hand, it would burn and I would need to wash my hands or I would have a nasty sore on my hands. Your stomach has a thick mucus layer protecting it from the acid that's inside of it. But sometimes we develop what we call peptic ulcers, which are sores along the stomach, lining the inside of the stomach. This is usually caused by a bacterial infection, usually Helicobacter pylori. And these ulcers are just regions where there's no mucus left on the stomach, and so the acid is burning against the physical wall of the stomach and leaving a painful sore. And this manifests as just really unpleasant stomach pain. So inside the stomach, we have three major cell types that line the wall of the stomach and do different jobs. We have mucus secreting cells. Mucus secreting cells make mucus. Mucus is not all that different from the mucus that you get when you blow your nose. It's just a gooey layer that's layered physically on top of the wall of the stomach, and it protects the stomach. In this case, it protects the cells of the stomach from acid, stomach acid, as well as some of those hydrolytic enzymes. Remember, there's some enzymes that are used for protein digestion in the stomach, and our cells have proteins in them. So if there was not a protective layer, our cells would also get digested, which would be bad. Then we have the two major exocrine cells. We have parietal cells. Parietal cells make hydrochloric acid. HCl is hydrochloric acid. And the job of hydrochloric acid is to denature proteins. Hydrochloric acid is a strong acid. The acid that we produce in the stomach has roughly a pH of about 2. It could be between like 1 and 2.5 or 1 and 3, depending on a couple of different factors. That's a really low pH. That's definitely low enough to burn your hand if you were to stick your hand in a stomach. I mean, if you think about it, like humans are meat, and we eat meat sometimes, and the meat that we eat has most of its breakdown. Most of the process of turning meat into goo happens in the stomach because of hydrochloric acid, which is produced by parietal cells. Then we have chief cells. The chief cells produce a compound known as pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is an inactive enzyme. Whenever you see ogen at the end of an enzyme name, it means that it's an inactive enzyme or zymogen. This inactive enzyme is an inactive protease, which once we convert it to the active form is known as pepsin. And pepsin's job is to digest peptide bonds, which hold together proteins. So the purpose of chief cells is to make an enzyme, which is turned into an enzyme, which digests proteins. And the way it turns into the active enzyme is pH. There's a cleavage step that happens in pepsinogen, the conversion of pepsinogen to pepsin, and it's catalyzed by low pH. So parietal cells need to be doing their job in order for chief cells to make viable pepsin that can actually digest protein.